Oh, I'm sorry. I think we had a small technical issue on my side. I'm sorry about that. So no intro this time. That's fine. Welcome. You're watching Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. And I can see there is already quite a few people in the chat. So that's really, really nice. So thanks a lot for everyone being here tonight to watch this discussion about the historical roots of faction in Root, which is, I think, a discussion that I've been thinking about and that I wanted to have on the channel for quite a while, probably since I played Root for the first time, and I realized it was a coin game in disguise in a way. And, so I thought would be interesting and trying to figure out what faction or representing what kind of political movement or how I could tie it to history. And I don't know, I forgot a bit about it, discussed about it with Liz at the end of last year. And she said, well, just send an email to Cole and Josh and let's organize it. And I was like, yeah, sure. Why haven't I done that? So that's what we did. New year, new exciting streams. And I'm super excited to have both of you joining us to have this discussion. I want to thank Liz for kicking me in the butt, like she does once in a while, for me to get going. And a lot of thanks to you, Cole and Josh, for taking the time and actually having this discussion. So yeah, that's very, very cool. Maybe before we start, I expect that most of the people in the chat will know, or watching this will know who you are. But I think it's always useful maybe to have a short presentation. So we can maybe start with you, Josh, if that's fine.
Sure. Yeah, hi, I'm Josh Yearsley. I'm a developer, designer, editor, blah, blah, blah. I wear a lot of hats at Leader Games, and over time have worn a lot of hats. So I'm currently, I'm the lead designer of the new Homeland expansion for Root. So we kickstarted this a few months ago, and we are hard at work on it. So, yeah, that's kind of my broad role at Leader Games. I've worked in the industry for about a decade now, doing a lot of rulebook work. My sort of origin story was as a rulebook writer and editor, and that's how I got connected with Leader Games. And over time, over the years, have come into more and more roles. So working on the Homeland expansion now.
Yeah, that's great. I know that I think the first time we've crossed paths was during the Zenobia, the first edition of Zenobia Awards. You
That's right.
were the mentor of one of the candidates that had this really exciting game about Muslim thinkers traveling
Mhm.
across the world, and I really enjoyed this game. I have a good I was really excited about the theme, and I think it's the first time that we crossed paths at that time. Do you know whatever happened with that game? Is he still working on it, or?
I believe he's still working on it. I haven't seen it go up for publishing, but I believe he's still working on it. But yeah, travels of early Islamic thinkers, philosophers, poets. They got into all kinds of things.
Yeah,
Very, very
such a cool theme, I think. Yeah, but yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I hope if he's listening to us that he gets motivation to actually wrap it up and do something about it, because I was really excited about that. But yeah, so that's for you, Josh, and you, Cole. Can you briefly present yourself?
Sure, I can try. So I'm the creative director here at Leader Games. I've also designed a bunch of games. In my, I like to frame it like I wanted to emphasize the creative director role because my relationship to the Root line is complicated. I did the design for the initial game and the Riverfolk expansion, but even those were deeply collaborative projects. And then I've just sort of helped shepherd all of the Root content that has come since then. So I work a lot on the Root line. I'm currently working on an Oath expansion. I think the next thing that I have coming out is Molly House, which will be going to backers in a few months. But I'm one of those lucky people like Josh and like Liz, I guess, to work full time in the industry. So we're coming at you from our offices or places of work, where we get to think about all these questions every day, all day.
Yeah, that's
When you put it like that.
Yeah, it's slightly torture, but
Yeah.
but a pleasant kind of torture.
A pleasant kind of torture. That sounds yeah. I don't know.
The reason why I wanted to mention it is Root was designed in the context of working full time on a game. Like it wasn't one of those things that had been worked, and we'll talk about this later. But it wasn't one of the things that had been worked a lot in spare time while I was doing something else. It was built within the studio for the studio.
Mm. But it's interesting because you say it's a pleasant kind of torture, and I think and Liz, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the origin of the word travail in French is actually a Latin word for torture, which travail means work. I think there is a connection here, or a torture device. So yeah, we were actually having a linguistic discussion right before the stream, so I'm trying to
it's
connect the
still
dots
here.
here.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
We were deep in it.
It's
Yeah.
medieval Latin.
Yes.
It looks like tripalium, an instrument of torture from
Yeah, exactly.
Latin
Very
tres and paulus, 3 stakes. Oh, that sounds delightful.
Yeah. I don't think that's the pleasant kind of torture, but it's and anyway, it connects to the word
brain hurty kind.
work in French. So I think there is an interesting connection here. But anyway, the purpose of the discussion was to discuss the historical ties of factions in Root, but maybe have an overall more examining how history informed the design of Root originally. And maybe this is where we can start from, and start with you, Cole, and then see with you, Josh, for the factions that you've been working on lately, how it works. But originally, do you feel, Cole, that the intent for you designing Root was to cover some political and historical aspects, but in a more approachable way, or it was just an inspiration? How did history inform your design originally?
So the initial concept of the design, it has these like twin births, basically. So the original, very, very early drafts of Root were just experiments in light wargame design they weren't even asymmetric. It was a themeless, just sort of thinking about what stops war games from being accessible, and is there a way to kind of cross that bridge. And then when I started working with Patrick, he offered this kind of project brief that said, okay, we've made Vast, we want to make strategy games that are asymmetric. How would you approach that? How would you approach the problem of an asymmetric strategy game? And I initially went to the asymmetric war games that I was interested in at the time, which were things like Runka's Andean Abyss, right? And I think this is the place. It's nice to be able to talk about this in the context of how Root engages with history, because the coin series is exceptionally important when it comes to thinking about why Root looks the way it does, but in a very narrow sense, because what Andean Abyss offered me was a way of thinking about what should constitute factional differences. What separates the government from the cartels, right, or from the FARC. And then once I had that sense, I thought, oh, well, this is a multilateral war game. It has 4 players. We need somebody in this kind of like quote unquote government peacekeeper role. We need an insurgent faction. And then that gave me kind of a pattern to start thinking about the positions of the factions almost like in an abstract way. So there wasn't like a hidden code. It wasn't as if I was working on a game about the war in Afghanistan and thought, well, we're going to dress it up with cats. Instead, it was much more formal. It was much more abstract. And then as I went into those factions, I was looking for models, theories, ideas from history that were well appointed to sort of sketching out those differences. I mean, one of the things I love about working on Root, and also any of the fantasy games I've worked on, or the science fiction games, is it allows a platform to think about history, not just ahistorically, but transhistorically, right? Like all war games are ahistorical games. They can't help but be if they're good, because they have to present other histories, and all fantasy games are transhistorical, because what they're doing is they're taking bits and pieces from the historical record and assembling them and putting them in conflict with one another. So I can give, I'll give a very sort of concrete example. When I was working on the one of the differences between the Marquis and the Eyrie is how secure their power bases are, their internal power bases are. The Marquis doesn't have to worry about being fired of their job. They might lose the game, but they know that they have their position. it's as close to a divine right as you're going to find in the world of Root. But the Eyrie Dynasties don't. They actually have to hold themselves to account, and this does something very sneaky, because even though the Eyrie Dynasties are positioned as a kind of royal, a lot of the trappings of monarchy and things like that are kind of in the logic of the faction. The actual mechanisms of the faction are about accountability of whatever the ruling party is.
And it's interesting because I feel like coin games usually struggle to have two counterinsurgent factions, and Root actually succeeds very well, because you could see the birds and the cats as two classical counterinsurgent factions, but represented in very different way, with very different ways of working and very different objectives. And yeah, so in a way, you were making a game about Colombia, just
yes.
so that's what it was all about. And I realized that Liz is complaining that I haven't asked her to introduce herself. So please, Liz, feel free to introduce yourself for those people who don't know, because you're just here every other week. So.
Yes, I will now be taking over the stream because Fred is canceled. Cancellation number 1 of the stream. No. I am Liz Davidson. I run a channel called Beyond Solitaire. We joke that this is the Beyond Ludane's extended network. But is this my first or my second time coming on the channel as a leader employee?
I think it's the second time, but we didn't talk about it the first time. But it's maybe good to specify that you are not an objective co-host here. You're actually making sure that I'm not saying anything bad about later games, and you're keeping me on a tight leash. That's
yes.
I got
our networks somewhere back here if we need it.
Our networks extend through multiple channels. There was a recent donation drive on Shut Up and Sit Down, where if you look very closely in the video, you'll see that Tom Brewster is moving some papers around, and one of them clearly says Leader Games bribes on it. So our networks really extend throughout the entire, influencer network of board games.
Definitely.
Maybe to connect it to those other influencers. So obviously Root had a massive success and reached an audience that a game like In the Abyss never did and never will, because it's a very different kind of experience, and I think it's a harder sell. But did you feel like the success of Root had an impact or generated interest in players that originally were not interested in historical or political game, and actually inspired some kind of curiosity to understand what was the idea behind this design, and explored not necessarily coin game, but more political and historical games afterwards, thanks to Root?
I'm going to pop in first and just say I've contributed nothing to the influencer bumps to Root, because I barely played Root before I started working at Leader. So I'm on a.
You really want to say that on stream?
I don't know.
I don't know when your yearly review is due, but I think you should be careful about this. I
got time.
Okay.
Needs improvement.
I want to say it is a testament to how much the company's grown that didn't even come up in the internal interviews about your hiring. So I thinking a little bit about the success of Root. I'll say one happy accident. So Root was never designed to be expanded. So one thing about Root that I think it's hard to even remember or keep in your head at this point is that when Root was designed, we had originally built it just as 4 factions. The crowdfunding did about twice as well as we thought it was going to do. And we were thinking about ways of packaging some additional content. Patrick suggested working on other factions. He jokingly suggested that we should have a faction that has lizards in it. And I thought, okay, well, what is lizardy? And then tried building, or widening the aperture of the way the game should work. And in fact, we can go into the question about why Root works with multiple insurgent factions later, because I think it's big and thorny. But after Root came out, I assumed I would never work on another Root thing again. I didn't imagine that there was any world that we would have expansions, or certainly the number of factions that we had. And then about 2 or 3 weeks after Root came out, we started getting player designed factions. And at first it was like 1 a week, and then in the real heady, early period, it was almost 1 a day. I think there's probably about 100 or 150 root factions that people have developed by themselves, different levels of finish, sometimes even art. And they pointed to something, they realized something about root that we, or certainly I did not realize, which is that we had accidentally designed a framework. It wasn't just, it wasn't simply a game, it was a game system. Now, Voco already knew this, because when he was working on Coin, the Andean Abyss was not really the first Coin game. It's the first Coin game that happened to come out. But there were other Coin games in progress, even as Andean Abyss had not yet been released. So I feel like Voco's work was very system forward, very modular from the start. And when I ran into it, I was totally surprised that we had sort of built the system. So the notion that the thing could be expanded or grown was completely outside of my imagination. And it's the thing that has allowed Root to become what it is, because I do think about Root as a framework, as a kind of like political sandbox. I mean, again, getting back to that trans-historical thing, if you're working with a trans-historical frame, then suddenly there's this core modularity, because you're not limited by the accidents of time and place in terms of who can participate in a particular conflict. You can pick from anywhere. And so that fundamental element of Root has allowed us to pull from a really, really wide range of historical subjects.
So,
sorry,
that's
I'm gonna butt in.
No, go
So-
ahead, Liz. I should have
So-
unmuted. Yeah.
So I guess I have a question for you, Josh, because you're sort of the man of the hour right now, because you're the lead designer on the newest expansion on Homeland. How has it been for you to kind of graft onto this modular system yourself? I know you've been a developer at Leader for a long time, and you've tested and written rules for and like done so much for other factions. But how has it felt for you to make your own contribution? And I know you were looking for holes in design, which I'd like you to talk about, but thematically, did you know what you were looking for when you started?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, Cole mentioned how we had never really planned to expand this beyond Riverfolk, and we sort of stumbled into that fact. And this sort of hit me first from the rules angle. I've sort of over time, basically, if you look at how the rule structure of Root is constructed, it's sort of like this tower that has a foundation. It has layers built on top of it, and you'll notice throughout the printings that I've been slowly like pulling out pieces of the foundation and like putting new ones in, because it's necessary for in order to support a lot of that new faction content. And so this is kind of the first layer whenever I think about like how a system, like how to design for a system. The first layer is always what are the rules even allow you to do in the first place? Do you have the right steps in a given action to support certain kinds of modifiers for that action, for example? So there are all kinds of things in Root that have sort of been rebuilt over time at the level of rules, including even basic terminology, that has been necessary in order to support some of these later expansions. And so coming into Homeland, basically, thankfully, most of that work that was necessary in order to make the rules side of the game support more concepts, that work had basically already been done. Like that was completed basically in Marauder. So like things have changed over time, but Marauder was a really, really large re-envisioning of like the way that the law was put together. There's a whole glossary of very specific terms now, and this like expansion in and specificity in terminology, now that that foundation is there, it was a lot easier moving into Homelands because that foundation was a lot more stable. And so thinking about design though, basically when I started thinking about the design of Homelands, the first thing that's very important is that the name Homeland emerged gradually. Over time, as the factions began to coalesce, the name to me is very important because it gives you the clearest idea and clearest definition of, well, what is this expansion actually about? Underworld, for example, is a play on words because you have the moles, which are literally underground, and you have the crows that are representing, a behind the scenes underground criminal organization. And so the name is very important. The name actually didn't coalesce until, I want to say, maybe about a month to a month and a half before the Kickstarter. And this was because after this many expansions, as you are creating expansions and as you are filling up the design space, you feel that. And I have certainly felt that constriction of design space in working on this expansion. And so finding that strong through line between the entire expansion, that was a very gradual process. I knew early on, so I took this mainly from the perspective of, first of all, what are the parts of the design that are underserved, that have literally nothing that touches them? And second, what are the kinds of movements, political organizations, governments, etc., that we haven't tried to represent in the game yet? And it became very clear to me early on that a diasporic faction, this is an extremely important part of history. There are, when people think of the word diaspora, they often have the Jewish diaspora in mind because that's the word originated in that context. But there are innumerable number of diasporas that have greatly affected conflicts all around the world. So I did very, very early come to the conclusion that diasporic faction was going to be one of those factions. And that slotted in very cleanly with a part of the design space that was underserved, which was the suits of the game. So throughout all of our expansions, we have used the same 4 suits: mouse, fox, bunny, and bird. The suit system, it has so much power to it, has so much power in terms of thinking about politics in the Woodlands, that the idea of adding a new suit and tying that to the idea of a diaspora, that came together very, very quickly. However, while that did come together quickly, the other factions, beyond their extreme basics, it took a very long time to find a through line. At one point, we were thinking about how to relate this to types of animals, to positions within the forest. So thinking about, for example, the forest canopy. But ultimately, as the concept behind the Bats faction, the Twilight Council, began to take shape, I began to realize that the interest of mine that was emerging, this is just kind of the felt sense of the expansion, my interests were resonating with ideas about what does it mean for the Woodland to be people's home. So this started with this idea of suits. Suits in Root represent the creatures that are living in this forest. If you're thinking about like the individual, like one by one, the creatures that are running around in this forest, the suits are really what is driving that home. You have your cards, you have your suits on the map. This is a whole different layer of thinking about Root than the factions themselves. The factions, a critical thing about Root is that the factions and the people in this forest, there are links between those, but there are different levels of analysis that you can apply to this game. You can think about the inhabitants, and you can think about the movements and power structures that build upon, that co-opt, that interact with the people in this woodland in all sorts of different ways. And so bridging the gap from thinking about suits and thinking about a new suit with this diaspora, was the bats as inhabitants of this woodland who genuinely want this war to end, and using more nonviolent or, say, less accelerationist means than, say, the Woodland Alliance. Because the Woodland Alliance is operating on this idea of they want to heighten the pain of this war. They want to get in people's way. They want to say, you are going to hit me, and that is going to generate resentment toward your cause. And it's an accelerationist way of thinking about a homeland. But that's going to cause so much violence, basically. And so for the bats, I started to think about, okay, well, what does a movement, what does like an indigenous movement of the woodland look like that promotes the end of the war, but in a less accelerationist way or a non-accelerationist way? So tying these two together, Homeland basically is this idea of these are factions that care about the woodland as a home. And what is that's kind of my center of gravity when I'm thinking about these factions, is what do factions who really care about the woodland as a home, how do they act in this context?
So I really like how like your two responses actually develop something. The idea that when Cole started working on the game, he saw it as a standalone design, and then there was this work of realizing, oh, it can be a system, and you worked actually, Josh, on making sure that there was a system behind Root that could make sure in a proper way that you could develop faction within it. So you started from a standalone game to a system game, you could say. Did you also have internally a systematic approach to designing factions? What is the process to design a faction, like when you're working on it? Is it like you're starting from maybe a historical context or a mechanical idea? How do you approach this?
Yeah, so it depends. As I mentioned about the Diaspora faction, really, the two kind of coalesced immediately. It became pretty clear. I honestly don't remember which one came first, because it was such a natural fit that it became quickly apparent that this was going to be a very strong design space to work in. For the other factions, for the bats and for the knaves of the Deepwood, it was kind of a discussion between mechanics and theme. For the bats, I have a lot of interest in decentralized government styles, and so I was reading a lot about in medieval Iceland. There is the tradition of the thing, or the folkmoot in other traditions, and this idea of how do we think about self-governance, basically? Like thinking throughout history, what are the different ways that like people self-govern or govern at a much more local level? And so because I wanted to focus on, like, I'd started to recognize this drive within myself to like focus on sort of the local level or the individual level, or sort of this devolved system of looking at the woodlands, rather than thinking about centralized governments, thinking about how do people self-govern, how does local governance work, how does ad hoc governance work, all these kinds of things. And so there are tons of examples of how in Iceland, as our modern sense of Iceland began to develop, these collections of people. There were farmers who had land disagreements. Like, well, I believe that this is my land, and another would counterclaim. In these kinds of contexts, if you don't have a very strong central body that like has all the records of all the farm plots, and how basically do you prevent this from devolving into violence? And so there's a history of basically, I would call them medieval assemblies, especially in Iceland, and there are various examples of Germanic medieval assemblies. And so this struck me as a very fertile idea for thinking about how would creatures in the woodland try to coalesce in a way, in some kind of movement that expresses their interests. Because the war in the woodland, while there are certainly invading factions like the rats and the moles that will have a strong element of external firepower, as it were, external bodies to fight this war, you need people in the woodlands to support your war in some way in order to keep things going. Like, to get food to your troops, to actually recruit more people to your cause. Like, you actually need the woodland in order. Like, if the woodland at large says no to your war, you're going to have a very difficult time continuing that war. And so this idea of, are there other ways for woodland creatures to self-organize, to sort of throw sand into the gears of this conflict to try to bring it to a negotiated peace? And so using that example of medieval assemblies, which were really just like ritualized battles. There's tons of examples of basically, like, a lot of these are not high-minded parliamentary sorts of things. These are not like, okay, we're gonna elect a bunch of people, they're gonna sit down in this body, we're gonna talk about it. This was basically Group A got a big army, Group B got a big army, there was some person who would mediate, the armies would come together, and maybe they would lay down their arms, and then they would try to come to some kind of agreement or try to de-escalate in some way. But the threat of violence was always literally, like, the pile of swords was literally right over there, basically. And so I should be clear that we shouldn't confuse, even though these were assemblies, we shouldn't confuse these with our sort of modern idea of how, like, assemblies work. So I hope that mostly answered your question.
Trial by combat is always more common than you think.
Yeah.
That's how we resolve differences at staff meetings, actually.
Yeah.
I actually think this is a great moment, since, Josh, you've given some really specific examples, to go back to Tim's really, really good question earlier in the chat feed. And he said he'd be curious to hear if you've heard or seen real world or historical projections onto the factions that make you uncomfortable, either because those interpretations like kind of miss your point, or if just projecting that into cuddly animals is too much.
I mean, I don't have any that make me uncomfortable, frankly. I've seen some, and it's because they are picking up on a resonance. I mean, I think that if you look at, I'm going to use Josh's term, an accelerativist. How did you describe it, Josh?
Accelerationist.
An accelerationist insurgent group. If you look at some of their action behaviors, what I find, I mean, and this is maybe getting into the heart of the games of Root's own politics, I find that political ideology is often a less important predictor of behavior than position and strategy. And so you're going to find people with very different ideologies using the same kind of tools. And so if someone does a retheming of Root that says, okay, I'm going to map Root onto the Vietnam War, I think there's actually a bunch of different ways that you can do that mapping that will accentuate different parts of the conflict. Like in the same way that, I mean, I think about Root fundamentally as being, it's more a work of political philosophy than it is a work of history. But in order to do that work, you have to do the historical work, which is why I agreed to come on this forsaken YouTube channel in the first place, because that they're closely related, right? You can't do history without political philosophy, and vice versa, right? And so I think that, if I see a reading of Root, that even if it's something that hadn't occurred to me, usually they are picking up on some kind of resonance in the core design that is harmonizing with something in their own use case.
And that's interesting, and maybe we can talk about a specific example, because I think that team question resonates with a lot of the discussion that we're happening around the Lilipa diaspora and the connection with Zionism. Was it something that you didn't expect at all, or something that you thought might come up? And what was your reaction to this?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly I knew that it was going to be a topic. As I mentioned, the word itself originates from a Jewish context, and when many people say the diaspora, that often means the Jewish diaspora. And so certainly, thinking about a diasporic faction and talking about a diasporic faction right now. Yes, certainly. I knew that Zionism was going to be a topic that came up. I believe at one point, I had a meeting with Cole where I was like, I just want to make sure that we're on board for, we are going to get a response. Like, that is going to happen. And to credit of Cole into the studio, we are going forward with it. For me, one thing that was a lesson basically was in framing. So the thing that I sort of regret the most about how we went about describing this faction was specifically as a diasporic faction that is returning. So one thing that has happened is in our original copy for this faction. So like there's faction design and then there's faction copy. And both of these elements are very important to presenting something to the public. And in the original copy, I made reference to the idea of a return, basically, that this is both a diasporic faction and one that is returning. The problem is that this very unreasonably restricts the scope of how we think about diasporas. It's just not, for a very significant portion, it's just not encompassing the full scope of this topic. And so I definitely, in thinking about this, the copy is did a disservice, I would say. It did not properly set up people to understand that there is a very wide range of diasporas out there who have different goals, different motivations, and different histories. Coming at this, it's interesting because the word itself, as we alluded to, the word itself carries a lot of weight to it, and it does have a lot of, for a lot of people, it has a lot of, it triggers a lot of preconceived ideas of what that word is supposed to mean. The word itself, we're gonna go back to linguistics and etymology here. Yeah. Exactly. There is so much in this word, right? For me, one of my I'll just talk about like a very personal touch point here. I grew up in the LDS church, Mormon church, and the history of that church, and what I was sort of taught in Sunday school when I was a kid, is this story of both traveling somewhere, traversing what would become the greater United States that we have now. At the time, it was just a territory, but traversing westward, both to find a home, basically, but also in a way returning to a spiritual home. And so this idea of return, this idea of finding a home, in some contexts, and the context that was most resonant with me, there are these very strange interrelations where even if something was not, say, a literal home for you, it can still take on this meaning of like becoming the place that you were always meant to return to. So I just wanted to give a little bit of personal detail to kind of flesh out this kind of struggle that has been happening in my head in terms of like how to frame this word diaspora and what this faction is. But there are so many examples of diasporas that have had great influence on the land that they were first dispersed from remotely. There are some that return. There are some that consider a new place to be a home that they are returning to. Different diasporas have vastly different ideas of what home means. And so in working on this faction, I want to try to give as broad of a palette as possible. But because both we have we have I think like in discussions around it, we have a lot of preconceived notions, and I sort of fell directly into that preconceived notion. That was a bad start for that faction. But my goal here is to give a sense of how does a population like how does a population find and integrate into a home? You know, what does that look like, especially when it is a home that is in the midst of a civil war? You know, there are many examples of diasporas trying to work around the fact that there's an active conflict going on in and around that place that they are trying to have a stable form of self-governance, of self-rule, of identity in. Some examples are the Kurds. Like the Kurds for me were. I remember growing up, and after 9/11 happens, I have this distinct memory of basically like George W. Bush or one of the top U.S. cabinet members talking a lot about the Kurds and our friends, the Kurds. And I had no idea. Who the Kurds were. You know, I was 11 or 12. But also, the Kurds were, even though there are tons of them, were in the larger discourse broadly unknowns. And I think that this is an example of how you can have a people, like huge, you know, stretching across just huge proportions of the globe, huge populations, and nobody knows who they are. And so I think that kind of drives home the sense of like diasporas. There's this weird thing that happens where you can have all of these people and they have to work in order to become known. And so that was kind of a big touch point for me.
The diaspora discussion really resonates with me because I'm a second generation descendant of some people that come from the Spanish diaspora. So people who lost the civil war in Spain and moved in France. And for them, as an objective, return was not really that important. It was making sure that if they stayed in France, they would integrate, but also that Nazism would be defeated, so they could have a new home in a place that was not their home country. So it's true that the concept of return was not necessarily an objective, and a lot of those members of the diaspora still live mostly in the southwest of France, stayed close to the borders, they're close geographically to where they came from, but most of them didn't consider coming back. Like once they created a new home here, Nazism was defeated, and they could live in a stable democracy where the fact that they were communist or anarchist was not a crime, was what was more important than anything else. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Maybe going back to the original game, I think there is an interesting question from Andre. So, and once again, Cole, I hear your point about like political philosophy inspiration more than history. So you can take it this question both ways. But what you say were the historical inspiration behind those primary factions, so the base box and the first expansion, either as political philosophical currents or potentially specific movements that you were inspired by.
So as a fundamental of design, and this is true of everything I've worked on, I really think about design as having fundamentally these two phases. And the first phase is about designing syntax and kind of the core rules of grammar and the core vocabulary of the game. And the second phase of the game says, okay, well, now that those things are established, what are the kinds of things that you can say? Try to write a poem in the language that you just designed. What's interesting about the design of the all the root factions is that, as Josh well knows, most of what root can say has been like outlined, unfortunately. There are certain things, there are certain words, certain verbs that root has that we can use, and you are trying to design, you're trying to write a poem in an increasingly cramped space because we have seen all of the other articulations. So the reason why I want to offer that as like a little bit of some set dressing here is because when it comes to a design in a faction, I will usually be thinking about a kind of puzzle. I'll say like, oh, is this a fundamental dynamic, let's say a historical dynamic, and then I will look at specific examples of that dynamic, but it can come from pretty odd places. So one of the things that I remember thinking a lot about, the design of the cats, right? So the kind of foundational root faction, and the thing I was thinking about is I wanted, if I'm looking at how the government behaves, this could be, the U.S. in I don't know, 2004 Iraq. It could be, the different kinds of nation building exercises from across the 20th century. What are the things that they're worried about? So, and this actually helped establish the fundamental currency of root, which is victory points, which is coming from the notion of legitimacy, that once you've accrued an amount of legitimacy, your governance is seen as inevitable. This is the kind of fundamental logic of root, and potentially the fundamental flaw in its model, because most factions, it's a first past the post system, right? As soon as you get to that 30-point threshold, you're inevitable. You don't worry about the fact that you might backslide, and actually very few root factions have any kind of forward or backward movement. And one of the things that occurred to me in the context of nation building exercises is that a lot of attention is spent on the movement of, the way that what gets called like biopolitics gets involved, which is to say, how are you engaging with the actual people that you are trying to also manage, right? And so for the cats, it's exceptionally transactional. They need to be using the cards in their hand, which is the representation of those kind of biopolitics, to purchase a number of their victory points through the game's crafting system. The crafting system is going to depend on their investments in certain clearings. This is a thing that is potentially just too subtle in the design, but if you can't put workshops everywhere. And the places where you're putting workshops are places where you don't have recruiting stations or sawmills. So you're having to kind of manage those things. And then the other element is, of course, the construction of buildings and infrastructure themselves, which is an exercise in logistics. And logistics at the scale of root is entirely about security for the management of the flow of resources, which is to say, you do care about who controls a clearing, because that determines whether or not goods and services can kind of move through that clearing. And then, of course, the cats have a way that they can kind of cannibalize their own hand through the spending of bird cards for extra actions, this overwork notion. That's really important because it shows that for these ends, the card flow is somewhat disposable. Now, how are they getting cards at all? Well, they're using recruiting stations. This is actually a place where I was thinking a lot about the role of recruitment. I mean, it's so funny, right? Growing up in the context of Bush Jr. in the United States, the Iraq War is kind of looming large on my budding political imagination, because it was just how I saw power enacted in the world for the very first time. And one of the things that really interested me was the degree to which the U.S. Army was interested in the maintenance of local forces. And a traditional 4X style game would not put recruitment and card draw in the same strategic path, because it seems counterintuitive. It's like, no, card draw is about economy. You should be building farms to draw cards. And I'm like, well, if the cards represent hearts and minds, then actually it's about local policing and your efforts to recruit and raise armies that is generating your interaction with the population of the game. So whenever players are doing any kind of analysis and per the comment that was shared, like if they want to become a better reader of Root, you need to be thinking about how is the faction managing cards, how is the faction earning its points. And those are because that's going to tell you how it's interacting with the people of the world, and then how it is generating its authority within the context of the game. And if you can build a read that uses those two elements, you're gonna find yourself doing some pretty good reading of the game.
So, speaking of reading into factions, just for my own edification and amusement, I want to talk about the lizard cult, because the religious studies person in me just wants to know, of all the ways you could have chosen to express religion, why a cult other than that they're inherently adorable, at least in lizard form, and then what understandings of how religion works and how it accrues influence came to your formation of that faction in particular?
They're my favorite faction in the game too. So I love talking and thinking about them, because I will go on these little sojourns where maybe I'm like playing a lot at the Eyrie and I'm like, oh, maybe the Eyrie is the one I like the most. But I always come back home. I always come back to the lizards. So the lizards are, I think where I want to start is actually with their management of cards. So I was thinking a lot about the history of Christianity when I was working on the lizard cult, because one of the things that makes Christianity successful, I think, among other things, is the way it appealed and created a system of value that was so different from like traditional sources of, I'll call it prestige, but I'm not really meaning like fancy palaces and statues of yourself. I'm talking about how you prove your purity. Right. And within Christianity, there is this notion of like the dispossessed, of the sort of, the weak and sacrificed God that is the foundation of the entire faith. And so the idea of, if we're going to build a religious faction, I think that this appeal is actually very similar to the growth of a lot of other religions. They always want to operate as outsider art. And so operating around the discard pile, where it's like, okay, you're going to be building your faction out of the discards. The discards are going to be a really important thing that you're paying attention to, because if you can have a sense of which cards are moving out of the game, that is where you're going to capture your inertia. Now, this means that fundamentally the lizard call is interested in what other players are throwing away, which I also think is appropriate for the early days of a new idea. I won't even necessarily limit it to just faith. So I was thinking a lot about Christianity. I was also thinking a lot about what the political ramifications of a militarized religion are. And the biggest one and again, you can start, the thing I like about working on root factions is root offers a very basic framework, a lens, right? That says, hey, these are, here's where the people are in root. Here's what they care about. Here's what a warrior is. Here's what a path is. Here's what a clearing is. Here's what a slot is. So root gives us that lens, that basic lens. But then I think the thing that makes root really powerful is that you can start using the factions as lenses for reading other factions. So for example, you think about, we were just talking about the marquee. And one of the things that the casts are doing is they care a lot about the control of clearings, because they're trying to move through wood through those clearings. But this means that as the religion becomes ossified and militarized, as it builds those little hard sites of resistance, goods are not moving as cleanly through those periods. And maybe I'm stuck in like a Gibeon framework, and I'm just thinking about the decline of the Roman Empire and what it meant to continue to turn all that gold into things that were being stashed in fancy facades and things. You're going to start gumming up the works, right? So part of what one of the things that is threatening the rule of, the governing classes is the notion that the board is going to start shutting down. This is and how this translates into the design, to get really specific, is when those lizards build gardens, what does it do? It allows them to rule a clearing. That gives them mobility. It hurts the mobility of everybody else. And the factions that care a lot about rule are going to care a lot about that garden's construction. Now, there are other factions like the Woodland Alliance that don't really care, because they don't really need rule in the way that the cats might. And so again, this is the lenses being allowed to kind of apply themselves to different factions. And there is no master lens. There's no single faction that you can use to read that you should use as your primary faction. I don't I don't like designing with protagonists in mind, and that ethos carries through to Oath, to Arcs, and certainly to all the other Root factions.
Maybe just have one last question to Josh before we look into some of the questions from the chat that I started and put away so we can reply to them. Cole, you mentioned something about the victory points, and I know that for me it's one of the aspects of the design that I'm the most unsure about. The fact that in the end, to win, you need those victory points, and of course you can gain them in different ways. But I was wondering, and looking at you, Josh, and feel free to criticize Cole's awful design decisions here.
If you don't, I will.
Yes. Do you feel like it was a constraint that was having a big impact on what you wanted to do with the faction? Did you ever think about having factions that win not using victory points? Is it something that you felt was within the framework that would became what was a problem?
Well, broadly, the way that I think about victory points is like it's slightly different from Cole. So, I interpret victory points as legitimacy, but I don't interpret it solely as some kind of governance, like centralized. Like you could think about legitimacy in lots of ways. You could think about legitimacy as the Woodland is like, okay, you get to have a central government, you get to rule over all of us. Like that's one form of legitimacy. But factions don't all care about that. Like the cats and the birds might. Vagabond sure doesn't. For example, Vagabond is a folk hero who wants to be seen as a cool guy who wants to be seen by the people as being representative of some kind of populist hero sort of archetype. So when I think about legitimacy, I think about it in terms of what are the different contexts that you can have legitimacy in. So, like, first of all, like I agree with the sentiment of like the first past the post thing does kind of like it elides this idea of the kinds of legitimacy that the different factions are going for are not all the same. And what the Woodland looks like after a game ends is not, oh, well, the winner is just the governor and everybody else is suppressed and that's it. I've really enjoyed, there are a number of war games that I've noticed coming out that are experimenting more with victory point rubrics, where it's like, okay, well, there is a winner of this game, but we're going to give you some way to interpret how victory, like what the descriptive element of getting so many victory points or accomplishing certain goals, or what does the outcome of your gameplay look like in a more fleshed out way. And so in Root, for something like the Diaspora, the way that I look at their legitimacy is first of all as a social legitimacy. So they are trying to integrate socially in the Woodland. The representation of this new suit in the game is fundamentally a social process. Like they are attempting to maintain a sense of identity that is integrated into the Woodland. And there are ways to get into the weeds here a little bit. So the Diaspora, the primary way that they're gaining victory points is through the integrate action, which basically means you have peaceful collections of that faction. You have this turns out to be a double suited clearing, so you have a frog token next to the printed suit. So it requires peaceful coexistence. So the primary way is basically by culturally integrating. There are other parts of the story that touch on assimilationist views. So that part of their deck, so they have a deck of cards that looks at all different kinds of ways of how different elements of diasporas have interacted with hegemonic powers, have interacted with people. Basically, what are all of the different sort of, like, if you were to take this faction and you were to shatter it into all of the different facets, all of the different interests in this faction, what would that look like? And so the faction tells the story of they are looking for social legitimacy. Like that's the kind of legitimacy that they are looking for when they are thinking about integrating. And you can kind of contrast that to, there's a card in the deck called Assimilationists, which they're examples of some diasporas that have movements that say, no, the right way to go about this is to sort of to pull back from our identity, to assimilate and become, part of, it's the melting pot metaphor, basically to push down your unique sense of culture and to assimilate. And it was very important for me in that example for that not to score the diaspora victory points. Instead, it gives them more cards. It's a sort of representation of assimilation may grant you some sort of limited form of social legitimacy, in terms of you may get some parts of the woodland may come over to your cause, but it doesn't actually score you points. And so I have this particular view of what the diaspora cares about, which is a differentiated social legitimacy. And so if you pay attention to kind of where exactly the victory points are coming from within the faction, I hope that I can sort of, it is kind of my view. Obviously, I mean, I'm designing the faction, so it is my view. But I hope that if you pay attention to like where those victory points are coming from, I hope that I can paint this picture of a social up to sort of a self-rule kind of legitimacy, rather than saying we want to be the government of the woodland, which is definitely not my intention with the faction.
Right.
That's super interesting, and I think it puts in perspective a lot what those victory points can be. So I think it's a good, it's a good point.
I think can I say that, Josh, you articulated why I think I'm sort of okay with victory points, because I broadly share Fred's misgivings about using them as a measure of what they measure, except when you're talking about a pluralistic objective where you have all of these different ways that the future can be imagined. You need something that isn't fixed on one particular element, and the notion of like an abstract quote unquote victory point actually starts to become really useful, because you're right, it's not just about declaring yourself prince of the woodland and calling it a day.
So we spent a bit more than an hour, and I feel like we could talk about this for a couple more, but I want to give the audience also the opportunity to have some of their questions answered. I want to start with this question from Chip, who's asking if there are any factions that you feel are underloved or unfairly mailing compared to the expectation of the designer, and is there factions that player ought to pay more attention to?
Well, the one that comes up for me is the Corvids. I think that this is mostly a response to competitive play. So, as with any game, there are all kinds of different audiences that are coming to it. And the Corvids broadly are considered to be an underpowered faction in competitive play for various reasons that I won't get into. But for me, at the level of sort of normie play, I guess I'll call it, everything up to the high levels of competitive play. I really like the feeling of like, I don't know if I'm going to win. I am sort of playing from this super underdog high wire. Like I got to be like really, really crafty. Like I have to make like I have to play mind games that are so 5-dimensional that like when I win, I feel amazing. And so like that just comes from my perspective of like both understanding that like, yes, in competitive play they are probably underpowered, although in recent tournaments they've been doing better, but there is this sort of tension of like, in order to sometimes produce this feeling of like this high wire feeling, sometimes the factions feel a little less powerful, maybe.
Yeah, but I hear you about the competitive play and playing the underdog, because I feel like it's a win-win situation, because if you lose, you can always say, well, in the meta, this faction is not doing well, so it's normal that they lose. And when you win, you're like, come on, like,
it is.
Like, aren't you amazed that I just,
the feeling of winning a game of diplomacy is Italy is the most transcendent feeling in gaming. Right. And I'll just say that I think you haven't, it's something that so few people get to experience because it is so hard. And I feel the same way about the Lizards, actually, which are, and I got some flack with this many years ago when I said that like the Lizards are not designed to be a very strong faction. They're designed to be weak. And in order for the Lizards to win, kind of things need to go backward. Things need to be a little upside down for the Lizards to pull out a win. But that's sort of the story that they're telling in the way that like whenever the Corvids won, like something happened. And it like makes sense because that's the context in which that faction should win.
I have a question here from Tim, which I think is a very good question, linking to cinema. We haven't talked about cinema, so
I'm taking not Corvids.
Nice. Yeah. So, and I think it connects to the discussion that we're having about factions that you think are underloved. Probably is if you had to play a root faction against death, like in Seventh Seal, which faction would you choose?
That's very good. I would play the Eyrie because I think it's the best faction. I think I could play. It's the only faction that I would, if I had to enter a tournament, it's the only faction that I'm going to be able to do tournament well at. I wish I were the kind of person who could win a game of the Keepers against death, but I'd lose. It'd be a very short movie.
And for you, Josh?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little boring because I was going to say Eyrie too. Eyrie is probably my most played faction when I'm just playing for fun. It is, I mean, it's kind of goes back to that like high wire thing of just like, oh God, how do I make this thing work? So definitely the most experienced, I have the most experience playing Eyrie. Although unlike Cole, because I played the Badgers a bunch because I designed them. So, the Badgers would probably be my next pick.
Yeah, that sounds like a good option too. Last question from the audience, and this one I cannot answer, so I hope that one of you will have an idea. Chip is asking which faction fits best as the Paris Commune. I would say that the Paris Commune was not a monolith, especially when it comes to political philosophy. So maybe a conglomerate of faction would represent the Paris Commune.
Well,
but
when we were testing the landmarks, we were testing the free city landmark, which is it makes it so that the clearing is of every suit. And I was playing a game as the Cats where I started with my keep in the middle of the game and I got so trounced, but because of field hospitals, I could always bring my pieces back. And I had never felt as under siege as that specific game. And it felt very much like the Paris Commune. So paradoxically, a little paradox because the cat, what is the Paris Commune but a large empire taken to its absolute smallest, coalesced into a little pin, the head of a pin.
And you, Josh, would you have any idea of what would be a faction that fits well as depicting the Paris Commune?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, it's kind of a struggle. If I were to do an absolutely massive stretch. Maybe even it really depends upon how they shake out exactly, but maybe even the bats, just because of this sense of like tons of different people all coming together in really trying circumstances and trying to do the impossible. Trying to self-govern in a way outside of sort of the larger assumptions of the conflict that is just bearing down upon it. Maybe that would be my answer. Yep.
That's a good aspirational answer too.
Yes, yep. Exactly. One last question from Sam, and I'm happy to finish with a question from Sam, because one thing that I want to say is that in a way, I'm also making this stream from Sam, from Lord of the Board, a good friend. And we actually had a stream on his channel with Liz where we were playing Root. And I hope that we're going to have episode 2 at some point. Maybe we should do it once a year. I think that would be a nice tradition.
We should invite Joe again.
Yes, yeah. That's the best way for me to get annoyed while playing. So I guess it makes for good entertainment. So that's probably a good idea. But Sam is asking, does Real Folk literally trade animals for services, or are they abstraction of supply?
No, they don't. They're an abstraction of supply. Usually I would never be so, I'm usually much more cagey, but in this case, it was so closely linked to the critical breakthrough that happened in their design, which is we needed a currency. So if there's a merchant faction, we need some kind of currency in the game. I didn't want to just include a pack of 12 coins or something. But I thought, oh, this is we have this huge problem because in Root, players don't have money. There is no money in the game. And then I was thinking back, to my economics books and the guns and butter question. I thought, oh, a rich faction is a faction without an army. A poor faction is a faction with a huge army. And so we can actually use the army as a kind of like negative representation of wealth, which then allows the Riverfolk faction to work. And yes, Josh, you're right. This becomes less simple when we start expanding the game.
Yeah. But I think it's a great place to stop. Of course, there are other questions. I'm sorry if I didn't bring your question into the discussion, but we are a bit ahead of what we originally planned for. I thought it was an amazing discussion. I want to thank you again, Cole and Josh, for taking the time to answer some of our questions and having this discussion with us. The chat was great. So thanks again for everyone who was here reacting, asking really, really cool questions. And Liz, once again, thank you for coming over and making me do things. And I hope to be on you. And looking forward to being on your show once again. We were a bit late on the whole wargame archaeology thing, so we probably should get back to work. So maybe something to discuss. But yeah, thanks everyone. It looks like Sam is going to invite us again, so that's pretty cool.
Yes.
And have a great evening. If you wish to support the show, you can like this video, which is okay but not great. You can subscribe, which is marginally better. And the other thing that you can do that would be great is actually supporting the show by donating on Ko-fi, and that will give you access to an amazing Discord server with a lot of weird people and a very extended and deep lore that we tried to introduce Josh to before the stream, and he was very confused and he wanted us to stop talking about it. So if you want to know more about that, you can go ahead and join the Discord server. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great evening and see you soon. Bye-bye.